Three,
Yep. We're,
two. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the second hour of the Santita Jackson Show on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. It's a joy to be with you today, and I want you to meet my morning stars on the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel. That's right. That's right. And I need you to like and subscribe, and I need you to click that bell so that you can uh, be notified whenever we come up. And I also want you to participate in this conversation with the Morning Stars. They have a conversation all unto themselves, and you don't want to miss it. And I want you to meet me on the Santita Jackson and Friends Facebook page. We're streaming there as well. And at Santita J on Twitter, at Santita J. Everybody, do me a favor, share the show with at least one person. Share the show, share the show, share the show, share the show. Let's get down to it. Here we are trying to get ready for these conventions. Milwaukee, the Republicans will be hosted in July. And but everybody is looking toward Chicago. We're trying to figure out what's going to happen there, or what's going to happen here, which is where I am right now. What do you think is going to happen? Will people nonviolently resist, as Dr. King instructed us to do? Reverend Jackson continues in that tradition. Or will we be provoked by the police? The New York Times finally did a study of the UCLA encampment and the violence there. The initial reporting made it sound like it was an equal fight, but the fact is, according to the New York Times, pro Israeli sympathizers violently broke up that encampment, but they've been doing that at UNC Chapel Hill. They've been doing it at Columbia. They've been doing it all over the place. And if they've not been pro Israeli sympathizers, they have been they've been police who've been using harsh tactics. The encampment at the University of Chicago, so nonviolent, lovely young people, as these young people have been. They've been peaceful, holding teach-ins, sharing food, sharing living space. Well, at 4:40 in the morning, police in riot gear came and violently awakened them and violently broke up the camp. Hmm. In the meantime, we're looking at this Trump trial. Some people are saying that this is the weakest of the weakest of the cases, and that they found a rather circuitous way to make this a felony. What does this mean as we're watching former President Trump continue not just to hold steady in the polls, but somehow or another, miraculously, he continues to move forward? Is it the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, where people are just embracing um, someone who's going to take it to the system? I don't know. I don't know. But let's, first of all, we're going to find out what the case is. But because I am in the middle of finals with Dr. David Gibbs, this brilliant author who is with us today and professor of history at the University of Arizona. Um, we're going to kind of sandwich you, uh, Reverend Dr. Yeary, brilliant lawyer that you are. We're going to put him, we're going to put you in the middle like an Oreo cookie. And what we're going to do, these two chocolate chips, one who's a vanilla chip, is they're going to give us the political implications, because all of these trials, I don't care what people say, they exist in a political context. They just do, everybody. So let's talk about uh, what we're looking at, because Dr. David Gibbs, professor of history at the University of Arizona, um, if they thought this was going to take former President Trump out, that is not what has happened. It seems that he is getting stronger. You know, the champion, you must knock them out. If you don't knock them out, they come back stronger than ever. But before we get into that, you have a book that kind of leads us to this moment that we're in. Um, because my parents said that after so many victories were won in the 50s and 60s, and really economic victories that Reverend Jackson pushed, because that was the last push Dr. King said was for civil rights, and of course a revolution. That's important, obviously. But the economic justice, that was really the push in the 70s and the 80s and 90s. But at the same time, we got Reagan, and we got a real pushback as we were watching people moving forward. What is the name of your book, and what is it about, before we get into Trump?
Yeah, the book is called Revolt of the Rich, How the Politics of the 1970s Widened America's Class Divide. It'll be published in 2 weeks, I believe. And it proceeds from the idea that we've had a tremendous concentration of wealth in the United States and a very small elite. It's been very well documented. And my book explores why that happened politically. And what I found is that it resulted basically from an organized, orchestrated effort by wealthy people to make themselves more wealthy, essentially.
Mhm.
And the 70s was a period of mass organizing by the rich. That's why I call it Revolt of the Rich, who wanted to repeal the last vestiges of the New Deal, of Roosevelt's New Deal. And they were successful towards the end of the decade, implementing what we now call neoliberalism. But that was not a natural phenomenon or an accident. That was orchestrated, and it was carefully orchestrated and very intentionally orchestrated by wealthy people who benefited from it.
Is that what we're watching now?
I think what we're watching now is, we're watching um, a lot of the sort of cultural, sort of vicious culture wars we're undergoing and hatred and so on. I would see it as kind of an effect of, well, a number of things, but one of them clearly is class resentment, is this enormous class divide. And people are angry on account of that. And, there's always, basically what you had is in the 70s, you had an effort by the rich to use the culture wars as a means of distracting people from what was going on. This was used very instrumentally by wealthy people. And you had, the Christian right emerging. I think what's been missed by this is that wealthy interests, many of them who didn't even believe in God or had very little religious interest, poured money into the Christian right as a means of distracting the working classes from the concentration of wealth that was taking place. And so I think what we're getting now is a continuation of that. We're getting cultural conflict as a way of preventing or sort of supplementing class conflict and distracting people from, their economic problems in a lot of ways, including, which often, by the way, is a racial component. The racial wage gap between blacks and whites, which is enormous. It's grown considerably since 1980. Neoliberalism is a significant cause of this. Certainly, it exacerbated it. That also, I think, has been sort of sublimated by a lot of the sort of culture wars we're getting, arguments over drag queen story hour and, use of pronouns, this kind of thing. I think a lot of that is a way of distracting people from economic inequality and sort of racial economic inequality as well.
Mm. What do you make of these trials and former President Trump? I mean, this, it looked like this was going to be a really boring election season. Because you basically had two presumptive nominees of both parties who, for one reason or another, uh, they were basically the only people who were running. And I mean, well, I can say that on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, I think Trump is just a lot stronger than people want to really admit. So, and thus the polling. You see in corporate media, the speculation is that, oh, these trials are going to make people not vote for him. This is basically going to be the final nail in the coffin. It appears that that's not happening. Why? I mean, now you got his former lawyer, his they call him his fixer, but he was his personal lawyer. And I don't know if this. What do you see? What's going on here?
I think what's going on here is, again, what you're getting is a populist revolt against what I see again as this regime of inequality. And you had two populist candidates emerge from the situation. One was Bernie Sanders,
Mm-hmm.
who, in my view at least, appealed to the better angels of people's nature, shall we say, and didn't engage in classic demagogic appeals, hatred, that kind of thing. He didn't do that. He did quite the opposite. And you had Trump, who did not appeal to the better angels of people's nature, to paraphrase Abraham Lincoln. The Democratic establishment saw both as a threat, and it managed to successfully parry Bernie Sanders, but has not been entirely successful in parrying Trump. Of course, he won one election. And if we believe the polls, he's on track to possibly win the next election as well. And so I see these trials Trump is being subjected to as an admission of weakness by the Democrats, that they're losing confidence in their ability to defeat Trump politically by making a more effective appeal to working class people. They're not really making that effective appeal, at least not sufficiently. And so as a means of avoiding the possibility that Trump might win the election, they're trying to use the judicial system to put him in prison, which I think is a very ill-advised strategy, and it's not working. There's been 2 impeachments of Trump. There's been efforts to get him off the ballot. Now there are 4 indictments of him. I should add, some of these indictments I think are very serious. The ones in Georgia for electoral interference, in my view, that's serious, all right? And that needs to be taken seriously. Some of them are not serious. And it looks like the only one that is now going to go to trial before the election is the one in New York currently playing out, relating to the fact that, or the allegation, I should say, that Trump had sex with a porn star, Stormy Daniels. That seems to be the main issue here. I mean, there's an arcane and difficult to understand violation of the law that really related to his payment to Stormy Daniels to keep the sexual affair quiet. And it seems very far-fetched even legally as to why this is a criminal offense. There have been claims that this is electoral interference because he tried to suppress and hide from the public his sexual affair. Although, the truth is, everybody does that. I mean, when people have affairs,
Everybody does that.
Well,
Everybody.
when people have affairs, public figures have affairs, yeah, they typically try and suppress those affairs.
And so do private citizens. I mean, you don't get on the mic, rocking the mic about a private,
Well, I mean, another way to put it, I guess from my standpoint, there are things about Trump that deeply disturb me, like his efforts to overturn the election through illegitimate means. That's very disturbing to me. I don't care about his sexual life. I really don't.
And yet that trial, we're not going to get that before the election.
That's right. It's a pity, honestly, because I think the important thing here is the Georgia trial. That's the really important one. But that we're not going to get that before the election, although in my view we should. Instead, we're getting, I'll have to be frank here, what seems like a very questionable, arguably ridiculous charge that is probably going to do nothing to harm Trump, may help him. If anything, I think it'll drive Republican turnout. Again, I've mentioned before, but I'll say it again. I'm old enough to remember the near impeachment of Richard Nixon, and that was done with restraint and dignity and done on the basis of legitimate charges. And the Democrats made an effort not to make it look political and not to turn it into a circus. And as a result of that, they gained broad support from the public, including many people who voted for Richard Nixon, decided Nixon had done something sufficiently wrong that he had to go. And it didn't have the sort of enormously toxic, divisive character that this trial is having now. And it reflects the fact that the Democrats are not being very careful. And I don't know who's advising them politically, because this is not helping them politically at all, as I would see it. And it guarantees also that if Trump loses the election, God forbid, we might have violence resulting from it, because the Trump voters would see, that Trump was being persecuted. I don't think he's being persecuted personally, but I think his voters will see it that way. And if he wins the election, he's likely to weaponize the Justice Department and the agencies of government to bring prosecution efforts against Democrats. And so I don't really see this as having any positive outcome, even from a political standpoint, even if you're a diehard Democratic partisan. I don't see how this is helpful from the standpoint of the Democratic Party. And honestly, I don't know why the Democrats are doing this. What this is not is an efforts to present this as an apolitical trial based on the law do not ring true. I don't think anybody believes that. This is a politicized trial of a sort that just, it doesn't look good. It's not a good look for the Democrats. Again, it suggests weakness, that the Democrats are fearful. They can't win the election based on a proper appeal to voters. They're doing something to get around that fact. and to try and put Trump in jail so he can't run. And it's just not a good look.
Well, hold on, because I see I've got Reverend Dr. Yuri who's about to jump through the screen. He looks like, I don't think so. So tell me, Reverend Dr. Yuri Esquire, do you take umbrage with his observation? And of course, you would have a legal analysis, and he has a political one.
Well, I actually have both. All right. As a
Mm-hmm.
pastor of a church, we are often appealed to in the season of politics, particularly on behalf of the Black community, to address the issues that are of concern to those who are often left outside of the room and their issues left off the agenda. So I'm clear that my perspective is informed by the fact that I am a practicing attorney.
Mm-hmm.
But before I became one of them, I was actually engaged in the work of civil rights, which is largely, to a great degree, political engagement, right? Sitting
Mm-hmm.
at the feet of Reverend Jackson and others. So I'm clear on that. Here's where I differ in Dr. Gibbs's view, and I think it's actually tied to the title of his book, because I was looking it up, and I'm impressed that Columbia University is publishing it, and the cloth cover. I'm gonna step up on the top shelf and see if I can get one of those and possibly get it signed. The revolt, I think that we are looking at as we are watching this play out is really an issue of how the system works for those who are entitled. You don't get charges in this case, in Letitia James's case, in any of these cases without going before a grand jury. Now, we don't know the party affiliations of whoever may have been selected for grand jury service, but there's a process. There are 12 people in the jury box, plus I would imagine 6 alternates. None have been dismissed at this point, who are listening to the case and the evidence. And the expectation is that the state, the prosecutor, has the burden from the beginning to the end to prove each and every element of each and every offense charged beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the framing. Here's what we're seeing, though. You don't see criminal defendants holding press conferences on the way in and on the way out with selective adjustments to who's in their entourage, as we've seen over the last few days. We didn't see it at the beginning of the trial, but now we do see that there is the politicizing openly, and it's on both sides, right? Trump is saying he's being persecuted, but here's who he's bringing. He's using this as an opportunity. The Speaker of the House was at his trial. A former adversary of his during the last primary at his trial. One who might be chosen, Senator Vance, was there, right? So we're yes, there are politics at play here, and the effort to say this is the Democratic Party's efforts to kind of challenge Trump because of Trump, I think leaves out a key factor in the middle, is that the people are embedded in this process. They are going to have the final say. It's not going to be who goes to the polls. It's, can you get a unanimous verdict from 12 people in the box? And as I understand it, of the core 12, there are actually 2 lawyers in that mix. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure what their leanings might be. So we still have to kind of play this out. But when we look at the entitlement of the other trials, the delays, that's me being energy efficient and trying to lower my carbon footprint. So it'll pop back on in a minute. In the meantime, me in the shadow. That you have this distinction around judges that may have been appointed by the former president, the one in Florida particularly, who has put that trial on hold, who has had questionable rulings before. What we are seeing is the system is designed to work for folks who are entitled to rely on the system. And it really doesn't matter what your political affiliation is. Those who have the means to expect a particular outcome rely on the system to get them what they're looking for. For the former president, it gives him a platform every day. He's not paying for commercials. He's speaking to the audience. He's talking at every break. The cameras are trained on the door to see not only when he walks in, but who walks in with him. There's a message there. What's missing is the part that we can't see. This is often the hidden piece that puts those who are not necessarily rich at a significant disadvantage, because they don't have the insight about how the system has always been designed. I mean, early on, when you mentioned kind of the history and the setup of the conversation with Dr. Gibbs, is that the history of making the republic more inclusive has often come down to the issue of class interest.
Mhm.
It has been the issue of how do those who don't have enough get enough voice to be able to lead to some level of redistribution of public resources so that that gap gets narrowed. That is the nature of politics. The problem is that there are other competing interests that the elite engage in and enjoy that they're going to protect. So that's why you have a Citizens United case that has been a thorn in the flesh of true democracy, because it treats corporations as persons, legal entities under the law, to be able to engage in politics in a way that most working people could never imagine doing. And so I agree with Dr. Gibbs that the deck is stacked. I'm just saying this is the battle of the elephants that often goes on, right? When President Nixon was facing prosecution, he got a pardon. There are a lot of regular folks who do much less than is obviously in front of us, who get a plea deal. And that deal is not let's make a deal. It is often against their interests, their opportunities, their long-term ability to recover from the harm. And so, yes, there are some systemic issues at play here, but I think we have to go deep to see what the implication is beyond this just being a target of one flawed, failed former president who has all kinds of issues, right? We saw some of it, Clinton, the special prosecutor, and him having to be deposed. And the ultimate question, it depends on what the definition of is that kind of lingering language. When we are observing this, the people who are, as the late law professor Derek Bell said, who are at the bottom of the well, the faces at the bottom of the well are looking at this system and saying, this is not the system that we're confronted with every day. This system, this layout, this playing out of what's going on is a special system that is designed for and established for the benefit of a particular.
Well, let me ask you this. No, well, let me ask you this, because initially, these charges, as I understand it, they would have been classified as misdemeanors, or certainly less, but they became felonies because they were connected to his presidential campaign.
Right.
Okay.
So this is what we call a paper trial, right? They're following the transaction. We often say follow the money. So this starts with we've got a story. The timing is just before the 2016 election. There's conversation amongst the inner circle, who's in and out. We're still trying to kind of distill that information. And so there's this plan to pay Stormy Daniels $130,000 to kill the story. Now, the flow of the money is the first $130,000 are spent on behalf of the president's interest through the Inquirer. The payback of the $130,000 to the Inquirer is initially paid by Michael Cohen. Then the payback to him is this elaborate calculation of he takes out this second mortgage, he uses this money, he's got to pay the mortgage back, but he's got to deal with the tax implications. And so Alan Weisselberg sits down and they determine, well, what the payback really needs to be is the repayment of a loan to Michael, so it doesn't show up on our campaign finance report, because really what this was about, to keep a negative story from going public to affect the outcome of the election. That's the general thing. Kind of a convoluted, complicated way to get it, but it's not beyond reach, depending on what the 12 people in the jury kind of get to. Because when you look at the money, first of all, most of the folks that would be in a jury that I have, they don't have $130,000 of equity in their house that they can get to even think about being a player. It is so far beyond the reach of regular everyday people to understand how this game gets played that at
So
the
they
end of
are
the
they
day,
peers? I mean, because aren't you supposed to have a jury of your peers? So are they
well,
peers?
no. The jury of your peers is your peers are not just your economic peers. If that's the case, then we don't need a system. Just let the oligarchs view what the other oligarchs are doing. Let them just have a club meeting. But the peers are those who are from the same geographic area, who are of the same or similar kind of experience in terms of age, education, background. There are a number of factors that kind of go into the peer assessment. But in that, ultimately, how many peers are you going to get of a purported billionaire, other than some other billionaires, to evaluate his behavior? And so I think that we go back and forth with that all the time. But what we often find is that those who really have something at stake are often not included even in the jury pool. So that is a thing. But the whole point is that this is a study, as Dr. Gibbs would note, since he is a researcher, he raises the questions, right? The thing about being a good researcher is not can you come away with the right answer, it's can you raise the right question and then let the answers fall where they may. The question we have here is this the way the system is supposed to work? And if so, for whom? And then secondarily, at what cost? And those questions, I think, remain to be answered.
Well, before we go to Dwight, I know Dr. Gibbs, you have to go, but certainly I want to hear from Dwight as well.
I'd like to hear from Dwight before.
Yeah,
I want to hear what he has to say about
I'm sure you would. So let me bring Dwight on. Dwight, let me see. Okay, we're going to unmute Dwight. Dwight, I knew you'd want to hear from Dwight. Dwight McKee, why don't you respond?
Thank you, Dr. Gibbs. You're right. The first you have to understand the politics start based on who decides to get charged and how they get charged. The process, the politics starts before the trial. The politics start with those deciding if there's going to be a trial. And so when you look at what Trump is dealing with, you can look at 5 other instances of people who've done the exact same thing at different levels who did not get charged. And so the charge of that deals with him having these documents, Biden had those documents, Hillary had those documents. They didn't get charged. The Hillary with those tapes never got charged. I think of Congressman Jackson, who had these charges imposed upon him for, some violations, election violations. And the congressman right up the road in Illinois did twice as much, took his money and redecorated his offices and his home, never got charged. So the politics start there. So the reason people are so suspect about this Trump situation is because, one, the charges, some of them seem a little convoluted. For example, him being the case he's dealing with now, which in any other world would be a misdemeanor. They've contrived that to turn it into a felony. And it's a stretch when you understand how the law reads. The other trial he's dealing with, where he's paying these fines based on the fact that he appraised this property at a higher and lower value, which is what most businessmen do in America. And he ends up with $100 million liability, at least. Well, they do this all the time, but the fact that he got charged was a political decision. And that charge has really never happened at that level in the history of business in New York City. And so the politics really is at the front end rather than the back end. Now, once those charges happen, it becomes even more of a dysfunctionality as America just to prudence go, because in order to really deal with a legal issue, you really need a lawyer. And what the rich has the ability to do once they're charged is to afford the best lawyers who know how to manipulate and maneuver in the law. Whereas people who don't have that kind of money, who cannot hire a lawyer, end up having to fight, put their lives at the mercy of the court or make a plea agreement. And so uh, the politics of the situation is not just how the charges are made, who makes the charges, who gets charged. It is then how they're able to fight once those charges go down. And so that becomes an issue of both race and class. Because of how America has been constructed, many blacks don't have the means to be able to fight a good fight, as many whites do not. And so they, at some levels, suffer as much as uh, blacks suffer at some levels. The advantage they have is because they're white, they're often given more benefits and benefits of the doubt, even when they're found, they're charged or found guilty. And so tends to be the hammer comes down on black people, where many of white people don't have that kind of, even when they're found guilty, don't have to deal with that. A good example of that is what's happening with you, Yuri, and in Baltimore with the district
Maryland
attorney,
Navy. Mhm.
who's being charged, unjustly. It seems that, but the sentences they're trying to give up 40 years, which is more than they, have given many murderers. I mean, the system is set up is almost set up to be unjust in the benefit or not benefit certain people.
Dwight, why do you think some, and feel free everyone to jump in. It seems that people of all backgrounds increasingly who are living under the boot identify with Trump, the former president. Uh, they view him as someone who is beleaguered. I mean,
Because
what was that?
because it's really what Yuri say. Because the system is designed to be a friend of the rich. The contradiction and the paradox in Trump is they see him as rich, but they have the same victim of the system as they would be. And so that's why they see him more as a martyr than as a criminal. Which, I had predicted 3 years ago, is that if they start putting these charges on him, that it would not play out the way they were trying to get it to play out. It would play out as, here's a guy who, because he's bucking the system and has all the advantages of the system, and they still have come at him and after him, that there's the injustice is not on his deeds, it's on the system coming after him.
Dr. Gibbs, what say
I
you?
obviously, I agree with that. It seems to me that, the Democrats are playing right into Trump's hands. This is his strong suit, is appearing as a martyr, a populist martyr, working class people, particularly working class whites, but increasingly working class people of color as well,
Mhm.
are seeing themselves in Trump, and that's an extraordinary thing to do given his net worth. And it's a remarkable accomplishment in a certain sense of the term, and really owes it a lot to missteps by the Democrats. I really do see this as a politicized trial. I mean, I'm thinking in particular again of the of statements by Rachel Maddow to the effect that she wondered aloud on TV if perhaps they could do a plea bargain with Trump, whereby they would drop all the charges if he agrees not to run for president. Well, there you have it. I'm in academia, and all of my friends are saying this, that they really hope that it's going to keep Trump off the ballot, convince him not to run, whatever it may be. And I'm sure that's the motive here. It's very hard to believe that's not the motive. And of course, you do have, indeed, prosecutorial discretion. A prosecutor doesn't have to prosecute every case. They choose which cases to prosecute. Alvin Bragg is a Democrat. He's very openly a Democrat, a partisan Democrat. It's taken place in Manhattan. I don't know the exact numbers, but it voted, 90% against Trump in the last election, something like that. And it's taking place in Manhattan. And it's very difficult to believe that this trial would even be taking place if the candidate's name, if the accused party's name were not Donald Trump. It seems to me very obviously a political strategy, and one that will have very bad implications. If it sets a precedent for politicized prosecution using the justice system as a political weapon, Trump, first of all, Trump will use it. That's virtually guaranteed. He will abuse it as well. I don't doubt that if Bernie Sanders had gotten the Democratic nomination, they'd be using it against him, because he's also kind of an anti-system candidate, somebody who's quote unquote a threat to the system. Is perceived that way, and that's what you do to people who are threats to the system. You throw the book at them, and we've seen this so many times before. And it's just a pity it's occurring in a case martyring somebody who really is a very bad person and a bad candidate. But this is the Democrats are doing this through political ineptitude. That's how it seems to me.
Which is why I said, 2 years ago, is don't turn a monster into a martyr.
That's right. That's right.
Reverend Dr. Yeary?
So all of this is to Dr. Gibbs's point, right? White collar prosecutions, particularly in the political sphere of elected officials, are always political by their very nature. Because if the conduct that is being critiqued is somehow tied to their operating in the political frame, then yes, you're going to have political prosecutions. And there are a number of them, Marilyn Mosby being one of them. The prosecutor that first levied the charges had made contributions to folks who had run against her. We've heard that before. Did it change the dynamic of how things are going to go? It's not really a party thing, because you have a Black Democrat appointed by President Biden, who's the U.S. attorney for Maryland now, and the state of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Maryland is still moving forward with that prosecution. What we have to be clear about, and intentionally clear about, is at the end of the day, and Dr. Gibbs and Dwight have both said it, is that elite white interests permeate all of the structures and the systems that reinforce elite white interests. Let's just be real clear about it. And so at the end of the day, you would expect a Donald Trump to be able to use it, whatever it was, one way or the other, because he is not defenseless in this. He's been able to put together his legal team. He's got the courtroom changing all of its operations because he's a former president. He's got pews that are reserved for whoever he wants to bring. The public, the general public, has access to 5 seats in the entire courtroom to be able to observe what's going on. The rest of it is reserved for staff, Secret Service, security detail, whoever Trump decides he's going to bring, the jurors, and then you might get a few folks. And I've heard stories where the guy that was first in line the other night started standing in line at 12:30 in the morning so that he could be one of the first 5 to get in. At the end of the day, we have to be real clear that yes, we can argue back and forth about, is this Republican or is it Democrat? What I'm clear on, and Dr. Gibbs would know this better than most of us. He's the historian. That when we look at the thriving of either the Republican or the Democratic Party, pick one, pick a period in history. No matter who was in power, white elite interests did not suffer. They just don't. And so the reality is what does this mean for the rest of us as it plays out? I do think in terms of the political outcome, if the federal trials are on hold until after November, the appeals court in Georgia has taken up the Georgia matter, so they're going to slow it down. They're slowing it down, waiting to see what's going to happen in the outcome of the judge's race when McAfee is now running challenged by someone we know. And now, when that plays out, does that appellate court intervene in trying to take that case away so that it doesn't just happen to end up in front of somebody who has been called a Jesse Jackson disciple? Let's just be real clear. And so when we look at the machinery of all of this, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. These are the elephants fighting. The elephants care nothing about the grass. They are trying to position for their interests. So we see it on the president's side. We see it in terms of the prosecutorial side. And at the end of the day, if this turns into a conviction or even an acquittal, because nothing else in terms of litigation is really going to happen between now and November. Now you have the framework for what the fight is going to be. One side will say, see, he's convicted. Does that drive a wedge in middle class, educated in terms of bachelor's degree, advanced degrees or higher, to kind of distance themselves? His base isn't going anywhere. They've already said, we don't care if he's up under the jail. We still going to vote for him. So this is really going to come down to who's going to have the argument. So when they settle the case next week, the jury gets it. If the jury comes back hung, then guess what? You're going to start all over again with the same kinds of arguments. The question then would be, what do you have to say about the issues? This is Dr. Gibbs's point. You're not talking about the things that matter to regular everyday people. Well, the reason they're avoiding that is because the system was never designed for regular everyday people.
Absolutely. I guess the question for me, though, is attorney-client privilege, right?
Yeah.
Which impacts all of us. When this is what happened to Bill Cosby. His case was supposed to have been sealed over, done with. Very wealthy man. And it's very clear that the system itself is not going to stop until they completely break him, not just spiritually, but own his properties, i.e. the Cosby Show, and take all of the money that his children would have inherited away from him. So there's that. And so I'm just trying to figure out, where it is that we go from here, because it just seems, and I know Dr. Gibbs says, I don't want to lose this friendship, Reverend Dr. Erie, but I know Dr. Gibbs was going to be here for 30 minutes, but he wanted to hear from you and he wanted to hear from Dwight. And I would love to see you write something up about this, because this is just fascinating. It's a fascinating discussion, Dr. Gibbs. But I'm going to give you an out so you can leave and come back when I ask you.
Sounds good. Okay.
No. But do you want to comment?
Comment. Well, again, I think that basically, the Democratic Party has become very dysfunctional, a very dysfunctional place. It used to have a working class base under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It's lost that base. And it's really become a bit of a snob party, it has to be said. And I think that's the big issue they're dealing with here. They're not that able to generate a lot of votes. Not very good at that. And out of that situation, we've gotten Donald Trump, who I suppose stylistically is not a snob, even though he's very dysfunctional in all sorts of very obvious other ways. Basically the Democrats are trying to make up for their failures by not addressing their failures, not having any internal debate, not having any self-criticism. And instead what they're doing is trying to, as an act of desperation, use the justice system for something it was never intended for, which is to achieve a political objective, which is to stop Trump from winning. I think the Democrats would just be better spent using their time to do self-evaluation. What have we done wrong here? And how can we correct that? How can we address working people? There are a lot of problems they can address. One of them is their love of neoliberalism, their endorsement of neoliberalism, their endorsement of permanent war and U.S. power projection, which is very expensive. military-industrial complex, and a lot of cultural styles and issues and vocabulary that just alienate people who don't have a college degree. And I think it's, again, I see all of this as being swept under the rug by the Democrats, and the solution they see is indicting Donald Trump. And I don't think it's going to work. And we could very well be up for another 4 years of Donald Trump. That may be the result. And again, I just see that as political ineptitude. That's how I see this entire trial.
Well, Dr. David Gibbs, your book again. Can we pre-order it on Amazon?
Yes, it's yes. You can pre-order it on Amazon. Yes.
And the name?
Oh, the name: Revolting Rich: How the Politics of the 1970s Widened America's Class Divide.
I am the hype master.
Congratulations on your book, Dave.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Sounds fascinating.
I can't wait. We're going to get him to Chicago. Got to get him in here, leading into the Democratic Convention, indeed the Rainbow Push Coalition Convention. Dr. Gibbs,
Great.
of course, Reverend Dr. Uri already knows this, as does Dwight McKee, and I hope everyone within the sound of our voices will go to rainbowpush.org, because 13th through the 17th of August, leading up to the Democratic Convention, we will be convening in Chicago, and it is going to be something special. Try and get Dr. Gibbs in here. Got to get him to do some book signings, and have some discussions, Reverend Dr. Uri, about what we are facing, because I think that we have gotten caught up in this circus, and it is a circus. The cult of personality, because that's what we're into. We're into celebrity. We're into personality. We're into looks. We're into all of that. And we're not dealing with the substance of things. I mean, the fact is, Reverend Dr. Uri, Dr. Gibbs, and Dwight McKee, people are being asked to pay for surgery in advance in the United States. That's a real, I mean, average people, they can't do that. People will die. That's what's happening. Our life expectancy is lowering. That's happening. People cannot afford to buy food. People cannot afford to buy a house. Well, please, they can't even afford rent. I mean,
What you're looking at, though, at another level, Santita, is that the Democratic Party wants the best of both worlds. They're entrenched in the oligarchy, but they want to maintain their the base of
with
you
the
know
populist face,
poor and the middle class, huh?
the populist face.
The populist base, without making any adjustments in terms of policy to accommodate that policy, that base.
But
And so rather than make adjustments on the policy side, they want to maintain, their connection to the money and the power, with like the Republicans. And so their only option now is to quench any competitive voice. So it's not just Trump they're trying to lock up. They're trying to lock up any dissonance in the party itself.
Wait a minute, because remember they were trying to lock up Bernie's wife. Remember that? Over
And
the university kerfuffle that we've not heard anything else about. Remember that during his campaign?
And they're going to lock up any dissent during this convention. And they're going to turn those who have a different opinion into the enemy, and make sure that that out of this convention, it has the appearance of some democracy, some democratic process. And the fact of the matter is, just like they're going after Donald Trump, they're going to be going after these students and these liberals and those who are anti-war. It's so when they talk about a threat to democracy, they are as much of a threat to democracy as Trump is.
Well, you know what? We're literally in the last 2 minutes of the show. So, Reverend Dr. Uri, 1 minute for you. Dr. Gibbs, 1 minute for you.
It's real quick. So when we can do an actual study. There's a convention in Milwaukee and there's a convention in Chicago. And they're both going to have their focus, and their priorities are both going to come out somewhat similar. in terms of where the dollars are really spent. Donald Trump started the U.S. Space Force. We actually have another branch of the military that came out in his 4 years, even before we get to the conversations about what's happening with women's maternal health. The agendas are going to be not that distinguishable from each other. The messaging is going to be clearly distinguishable. And at the end of the day, the people who are most affected got to figure out how they're going to get what they need out of a process that's stacked against them.
Dr. Gibbs?
I think we're dealing with is a very kind of dried up and dysfunctional political system that most strikingly, of course, that we have two candidates who are deeply unpopular. Neither of these candidates are popular. And neither of them are really able to address, well, first of all, the issue of economic inequality of the sort that I've described, the issue of incarceration, over-incarceration, the issue of the racial wage gap. All of these things basically are things that the political system seems incapable of addressing. And it seems that rather than trying to have debate on that issue with the Democratic Party, again, the Democratic Party, I think, is just as much at fault here as the Republican Party. I used to think they were a little bit better than the Republicans. I've given up on that idea. I think they're equally dysfunctional at this point. And, again, I see this trial as just part of the evidence of sort of almost a dying political system, one that basically is engaging in sort of deeply toxic and negative activity in this case that are just doing nothing but alienating the public and not addressing the central issues that the public is interested in. This trial is part of that.
Well, now the book?
I'm sorry?
Your book that we can pre-order on Amazon?
Oh, Revolt of the Rich, How the Politics of the 1970s Widened America's Class Divide.
I'm helping to train you so you can do this on other
Well,
media.
I appreciate it.
I'm going to help you. I'm going to help you. Everybody, rainbowpush.org. August 13th through the 17th, we will be convening here at our international conference. And we want all people who are coming to Chicago for this DNC conference, this opportunity for Americans' voices to be heard. We want you to meet at rainbowpush.org. So please stay tuned, keep apprised of what we're doing, because, push works for you. Push works for you. I cannot wait to see all of you at the Rainbow Push International Conference. Reverend Dr. Uri will be there, Dwight McKee will be there, and so will Dr. David Gibbs, and so many of us. We're all coming to Chicago. And Chicago, as Dr. Bob Stark said in the previous hour, is going to be hot, hot, hot. And we're not going to get burned by it. We're going to get warmed by it. We're going to be a better nation, eventually. I'm Santita Jackson. This is AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive ministry.